We have the pleasure to welcome today Professor Steve Davies from the University of Manchester in Great Britain. Professor Davies, is there a link, according to you, between the lack of economic freedom and underdevelopment in Africa?
Well, quite definitely, but there's a few things you can say about this. One thing to point out is that although a lot of Africa is doing very badly in comparative economic terms and is severely underdeveloped, in the last 10 to 15 years, many parts of Africa have actually experienced significant economic success. Mozambique, for example, Tanzania in the last 5 or 6 years, both have seen significant economic growth. Zambia has also had a considerable amount of success. And there's the great shining exception of Botswana, which is by any standards one of the most successful economies, not just in Africa, but worldwide. Now, there's no doubt that there is a clear connection between the lack of economic freedom and the lack of economic development in large parts of Africa. One of the major problems facing Africa is the imposition of strict tariffs and import controls by national governments throughout Africa. Generally speaking, if you're in an African country, it is actually easier to export to Europe or North America than it is to export to another African country because of the trade barriers that are put in place. This is quite simply insane and is a severe impediment to all kinds of economic growth and development in large parts of Africa, particularly, but not exclusively, south of the Sahara. There's also the whole question of government controls and of the pursuit by governments of the outdated and completely destructive policy of import substitution, which was very popular at one time in Africa when it was followed by people like Sékou Touré and other leaders of that sort in the western francophone part of Africa, and then also by Julius Nyerere and his emulators in the eastern, more anglophone part of Africa. All of these are a severe impediment to economic growth, just as they are in other parts of the world. However, it's worth adding that Africa has an additional problem, if you will, which is, if anything, even more severe, and that is the lack of the rule of law in large parts of the continent. Even if you were to, for example, do away with much of the controls, there's the additional problem of extremely predatory elites and people who use political power and violence or the threat of violence to extract large rents and income streams from productive people, businesses, firms, farmers and the like. And this is a problem throughout Africa. So I would say that although lack of economic freedom is one factor, just as important, if not more important in some places, is the lack of the rule of law and the problem of governance, the fact that governments throughout Africa are highly predatory. One of the consequences of this is that the easiest way to become exceptionally wealthy in many parts of Africa is not through productive activity, but through capturing control of the state and then using the state's power to enrich yourself. And this creates very bad incentives for large numbers of people. One of the reasons why Botswana is so successful is precisely because it has the rule of law, it has a reasonably honest and effective government, and it has political transparency. All of that gives it an enormous advantage over its neighbours, and the comparison is quite telling.
What is, according to you, the impact of colonialism on Africa?
The impact is very negative, but not quite in the way that people commonly suppose. The common notion is that colonial powers exploited Africa in terms of taking raw materials out of it, looting it in the kind of common parlance, and that they essentially profited significantly from African colonialisation. That actually is not true. You need to remember, first of all, that direct rule of most of Africa does not really start until the 1890s. Until the Berlin Conference at the end of the 1870s, most of the European powers only had control over the immediate coasts and not very far inland at all. It's only in the early part of the 20th century that you really start to get significant control exercised by colonial powers over the interior of Africa, starting a bit earlier in places like the Congo with the appalling policy of King Leopold. And so we're talking about a phenomenon that lasts really about 70 years. Secondly, in fact, African colonies were not particularly profitable, if indeed they were profitable at all for the European powers. The great profits that were made by overseas investment in the late 19th and 20th century were not made by investing in Africa. They were made by investing in largely the United States, elsewhere in Europe, in Russia, and to some extent in parts of Asia. So the exploitation or the damaging effect, rather, of colonialism upon Africa does not come about from some crudely understood process of exploitation or the creation of a peripheral economy as commonly supposed. The real damage arises from two things. The first is the way in which the Berlin Conference leads to Africa being carved up by European powers on a totally arbitrary basis. so that all sorts of frontiers are drawn on the ground which have absolutely no relationship to or correlation with demographic, geographical, economic or political realities. So entire large African nations such as the Bakongo are carved up between three states. The Bakongo are now found in Congo-Brazzaville, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and in Angola in roughly equal proportions. Similarly, completely separate and distinct political entities like Baganda, for example, are lumped in with lots of other territories to form an artificial entity, in this case the British Crown Colony of Uganda. And this creates political entities which are fundamentally unnatural and unstable. And this is the main reason why, in my opinion, it has proved so difficult to construct stable, orderly systems of government and law in the aftermath of independence. You're dealing with totally arbitrary and unnatural entities. The second damaging effect of colonial was the way in which, in many parts of Africa, the colonial governments, not always deliberately, undermined traditional and indigenous institutions and forms of governance and rule and law, and replaced them with either legal codes and systems imported from Europe, or even worse, with a leadership consisting of Africans who had been educated often in very misleading and mistaken ideas, socialist ideas, at institutions like the Sorbonne or the LSE. So when independence came, one of the very damaging legacies of colonialism was that the Europeans typically handed over not to indigenous people and did not allow the development of indigenous institutions, whether market-based or otherwise. Instead, they handed over power to these deracinated elites who had been brought up in the doctrine of socialism in Paris or London. And the combination of that with the demarcation of completely arbitrary and artificial borders was disastrous. The other, third, really disastrous legacy of colonialism was the introduction of the standing army principle into large parts of Africa, because this created an institution totally contrary to African traditions, incidentally, which gave predators enormous power and access to the means of violence on a large organised scale, which would not have been the case before, and which disarmed the mass of the population and left them at the mercy of the predators.
What part did the slave trade play in African history?
The part it played is enormous, but it's commonly misunderstood. The thing to realise is that the slave trade internally within Africa had existed for thousands of years, certainly as far back as the time of Jesus, for example. And slavery was a widespread, well-established institution in Africa from very early times. It took the form essentially of people being captured in warfare. And if you were captured in warfare, you would become a slave and you'd be taken to work for the victors. You might then be traded on elsewhere. What begins to happen from the early to mid-16th century onwards is that there's an increasingly a slave trade driven by external demand, in which Africans increasingly export large numbers of their fellow Africans to markets outside Africa. And this is done through three major trade systems. One, which is well known, is the transatlantic trade route to Brazil, the West Indies, Spanish South America, and, although it's very minor in fact, the North American colonies. The second is the trans-Saharan trade route to Cairo in the Middle East, and the third is the Indian Ocean trade route from the trading cities along the coast to the Indian subcontinent and again the Middle East, particularly Iran. Now, the Arab and European traders who do this pay for the slaves that they purchase with firearms. This creates a devastatingly bad set of incentives, because it means that the Africans who have got the firearms in exchange for slaves now have an enormous military advantage over their neighbours and rivals. This then means that they can expand their territory and create large empires based upon slave taking. States such as the Ashanti Empire in what is now Ghana, the Lunda Empire in southeast Congo, northeast Angola, the Kingdom of Bakongo, the Oyo Kingdom in what is now Nigeria, and the like. The people who are the victims of these predatory empires only have two choices, really. Either they become slaves, or they become slave takers themselves. And so there's a devastating consequence for this.
Professor Davies, thank you very much.
Okay.